A black man walks into a courtroom for a simple traffic ticket. But before he can even speak, the judge hurls a racist remark and slaps him with a massive fine. The judge thinks he's just dishing out another dose of authority, until the man calmly says 7 words that freeze the entire room: "I'm a federal prosecutor with the DOJ." What happens next? You won't believe how fast the tables turn. It started like any other ordinary morning in a quiet courtroom in Mississippi. The room buzzed with a mixture of lawyers, court staff, and everyday citizens waiting their turn to face traffic violations and minor infractions. These were usually routine cases: speeding, expired tags, parking tickets. Nothing unusual. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge Ronald Jeffries, a man who had spent over 2 decades on the bench. Known locally for his short temper and cutting remarks, Jeffries was the type of judge who didn't mince words. Many who appeared before him said he had a tendency to talk down to people, especially those who didn't look like him or who didn't wear a suit. That morning, Judge Jeffries was visibly irritated. The docket was long, the room was full, and he had no patience for anyone he perceived as wasting his time. Then the door opened, and a well-dressed black man stepped inside. He was wearing a dark navy suit, polished shoes, and carried a leather briefcase. His posture was upright, his demeanor calm and confident, like someone used to being in courtrooms, but perhaps not in this particular seat. He quietly took his place and waited for his name to be called. The judge glanced down at the next name on his list and then looked back up at the man. Without missing a beat, Judge Jeffries muttered just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "Another one of you people, huh?" The courtroom went still. A few heads turned. A murmur started to ripple through the benches. The man didn't react. He simply kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable. But Judge Jeffries wasn't finished. Louder now, he leaned forward and said, "Let me guess, you're gonna try to talk your way out of this one." There were audible gasps. One woman in the back covered her mouth in disbelief. A young court clerk's eyes widened in shock. This wasn't just disrespect, it was a racial insult. A statement dripping with prejudice, made in a courtroom that was supposed to represent justice. Still, the man said nothing. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He stood when asked and handed the bailiff his paperwork. His citation was for a rolling stop at a stop sign, one of the most common and minor traffic violations out there. There had been no accident, no danger, and no confrontation with the police. Just a citation issued in a suburban neighborhood 2 weeks earlier. Ordinarily, someone with a clean record and respectful tone might get the fine reduced or even dismissed entirely. But Judge Jeffries had already made up his mind. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you," he snapped. "You come in here dressed like you're somebody important, thinking you'll walk out without consequences." The judge didn't ask for context. He didn't review the dashcam footage submitted as evidence. He didn't even let the man speak in his own defense. Instead, with a smug smirk, he banged his gavel and handed down a $500 fine, more than 3 times the usual amount for that type of infraction. "I don't care who you think you are," the judge added. "You're in my courtroom now." At that moment, you could feel the air shift in the room. Something wasn't right. Even those used to seeing Judge Jeffries bark at defendants could tell. This wasn't just harsh, it was deeply personal. Still calm and collected, the man reached into his briefcase to retrieve his wallet and pay the fine. But before doing so, he looked up at the judge and said something that would change everything. "Actually, Your Honor, my name is Eric Madison. I am a federal prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice." The silence that followed was deafening. People turned in their seats. The judge blinked, stunned. His mouth opened, then closed. It was as if the courtroom had frozen in time. The man continued, "And I know what proper courtroom procedure looks like. I also know when a judge steps outside the bounds of impartiality. This interaction, Your Honor, will be reported to the State Judicial Review Board." What had started as a simple traffic hearing was now on the verge of national headlines. The judge had made a critical mistake, not just because he had insulted the wrong person, but because he had exposed something much deeper, the kind of systemic bias that too often hides behind a robe and a gavel. And the man he thought he could humiliate, he was about to shine a very bright light on it. The courtroom was already on edge. The tension had been growing since Judge Jeffries made that now infamous comment, "Another one of you people, huh?" as a well-dressed black man stood quietly before him. But what happened next would push the situation from uncomfortable to unbelievable. Instead of following the usual protocol, asking the defendant to explain his side, reviewing the traffic citation, or even considering the dashcam footage that had been submitted, Judge Jeffries launched into a full-blown rant. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the man in front of him, and spat out the words, "You people always think the rules don't apply to you. I've seen it 1,000 times before." There was no pretense of professionalism now. The judge wasn't asking questions. He was making accusations, and worse, assumptions. "You're lucky I don't throw the book at you right now," he continued, his voice rising with every word. The man didn't respond. He stood still, hands at his sides, his expression calm, but his eyes told a different story. According to several people in the room, you could see a flicker of disbelief mixed with something else, restraint. This wasn't the first time he had faced discrimination. But even so, being treated like this in a courtroom, by a judge, was something else entirely. And still, he said nothing. Because in a courtroom, interrupting a judge, even in defense of yourself, can be dangerous. It can escalate a situation. It can cost you more than just money. It can cost you your freedom. So he bit his tongue and let the judge keep going. The judge flipped through the paperwork, ignoring the fact that the alleged violation, a simple rolling stop, was a minor, non-dangerous offense. Under normal circumstances, it might have earned someone a $100 fine or a small warning. But these weren't normal circumstances. Without reviewing evidence, without hearing testimony, without even acknowledging the man's clean driving record, the judge slammed his gavel and barked, "You can pay your fine at the front desk. That'll be $500. There was a collective gasp in the room. $500? For a rolling stop? That was more than 3 times the typical fine, and completely unheard of in that courtroom, especially for a first-time offense. Some people seated on the benches began whispering. Even the court clerk hesitated for a second, glancing at the paperwork as if to double-check the number was real. But Judge Jeffries wasn't done. As the man quietly reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet to comply, the judge leaned back in his chair with a smug smile and delivered one final insult. "I don't care who you think you are, you're in my courtroom now." That line hit like a slap in the face. And for a second, time seemed to stop. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it, that moment when the judge's arrogance crossed the line. It wasn't just disrespect anymore. It was personal. It was racial. But what the judge didn't realize, what he had completely failed to see in his rush to assert dominance, was that the man standing before him wasn't just another name on the docket. He wasn't just some guy in a nice suit trying to get out of a ticket. He was someone who knew the law better than most people ever would. And he was about to use that knowledge. Because just as the judge was getting ready to move on to the next case, the man calmly cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was measured, calm, and razor-sharp. "Actually, Your Honor, my name is Eric Madison. I'm a federal prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice." And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. The smug look disappeared from the judge's face. You could see it, the split-second realization that he had messed up. Badly. This wasn't a man he could bully into silence. This wasn't someone who would pay the fine and walk away. This was someone who had the power, the knowledge, and the platform to hold him accountable. Eric continued, still calm but with a new edge in his tone. "And what I just witnessed in your courtroom is not only unethical, it's potentially grounds for judicial misconduct. I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Judicial Board." There were murmurs again, but now, they weren't whispers of confusion. They were gasps of realization. People were pulling out their phones. The court reporter's hands paused above the keys. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably in place. The judge, once so confident, now looked rattled. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The man he had tried to humiliate was no ordinary defendant. He was someone who had the training, the experience, and the credibility to bring this situation into the light. And the judge? He had just made himself the headline of a story that was about to go viral. The judge thought it was over. He had delivered the fine, $500, 3 times the standard penalty, and made it crystal clear that he was in charge. He had sneered, insulted, and spoken with the full confidence of someone who'd been sitting on the bench for far too long without being challenged. The courtroom was tense. Everyone seemed ready to move on, eyes lowered, minds processing what they had just witnessed. But then, for the first time that morning, the man finally spoke. His voice was calm, even, measured. But every word carried the weight of something more than confidence. Authority. "Actually, Your Honor," he said, straightening his posture and meeting the judge's eyes, "my name is Eric Madison. I am a federal prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice." The effect was immediate. The buzzing courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed to pause. For a full 3 seconds, you could have heard a pin drop. The same judge who had just been so loud and arrogant suddenly froze. His smug expression dropped. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had just slammed the gavel moments before, gripped the edge of the bench as if trying to stay upright. This wasn't just any defendant. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Eric Madison didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or rage. He didn't need to. Because unlike most people who appear in traffic court, Eric knew the system inside and out. He had spent years working with judges, real judges. He knew what judicial integrity looked like. He had prosecuted major federal cases and helped put away white-collar criminals and violent offenders alike. His understanding of the law was deep and precise. So when he said the next words, they hit like a hammer. "And I know my rights," Eric continued. "I also know what judicial misconduct looks like. I'm not here to argue, but I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Judicial Review Board." No one moved. The bailiff looked at the judge, unsure whether to step in or stay put. The court reporter lowered her hands from the keyboard. Even the people seated in the gallery leaned forward, unable to believe what they were hearing. The judge's face went pale. You could see it in his eyes. He knew he had crossed the line. He also knew this wasn't going to be one of those situations where he could just brush it under the rug. You see, federal prosecutors aren't just any attorneys. They work alongside judges, U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and high-level law enforcement every day. They're trained to identify bias, abuse of power, and systemic corruption. Eric wasn't just speaking from emotion. He was speaking from experience. And what he had just witnessed and experienced was textbook judicial misconduct. Racially charged language. Denying the defendant the right to speak. Ignoring submitted evidence. Issuing an excessive fine without legal justification. All of this in a court of law, on record, in front of witnesses. Eric wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. And now, neither would the people watching. The judge had tried to use power to intimidate. But Eric Madison had truth and law on his side, and that was far more powerful. Still keeping his cool, Eric placed the fine money on the table, made a formal note of the court date and case number, and turned to leave. But before he exited, he paused. He looked back toward the judge and said one final line. "Justice isn't about how much power you have. It's about how you use it. And you've forgotten that." With that, Eric walked out of the courtroom, his head high, his purpose clear, and the room left in stunned silence behind him. The judge remained frozen in place. He had just learned, too late, that not everyone he disrespects will stay silent. And in trying to put someone in their place, he had exposed his own. Because now, this wouldn't be handled behind closed doors. It would go to the board. It would go to the press. And eventually, it would go to the people. What happened in that Mississippi courtroom didn't stay there. Within 24 hours, Eric Madison filed an official complaint with the State Judicial Review Board. The report was detailed and professional, outlining exactly what happened, step by step. He submitted the case file, referenced the court transcript, and requested the release of the courtroom audio. He wasn't just filing for himself. He was filing for everyone who had ever sat in that courtroom and felt voiceless. And he made sure his complaint landed in the right hands. Within 48 hours, the story broke on local news. A small TV station in Jackson aired the headline, "Federal Prosecutor Fined by Judge, Files Misconduct Complaint After Racial Outburst." At first, it was just a local scandal. But that quickly changed. Within a week, the story had gone viral online. The audio from the courtroom, captured legally and released under public transparency laws, was shared on social media platforms, racking up millions of views within days. You could clearly hear the judge's comments. "Another one of you people, huh? You people always think the rules don't apply to you. I don't care who you think you are, you're in my courtroom now." People were outraged. The video clips and audio highlights flooded TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Hashtags like #JusticeForEric and #FireJudgeJeffries began trending nationwide. And soon, national news outlets picked up the story. Interviews with legal experts, civil rights leaders, and even former defendants who had stood before Judge Jeffries began airing. The media attention snowballed into something far bigger than anyone expected. Journalists dug deeper, and what they found was chilling. For over a decade, Judge Ronald Jeffries had presided over thousands of cases in that courtroom. But now that a spotlight had been turned on him, patterns started to emerge, disturbing patterns. Civil rights groups began combing through his past rulings and sentencing records. What they discovered shocked even longtime advocates. Disproportionately high fines for Black and Hispanic defendants. Dismissive courtroom language, calling defendants troublemakers, thugs, or just another statistic. Unequal treatment when defendants of color brought legal representation. And in some cases, even evidence suppression that disadvantaged minority defendants. Stories began pouring in. A Black single mother who was fined $750 for disrupting court proceedings when she asked if she could explain her situation. A teenage boy given the maximum sentence for a first-time offense, while a white peer with the same charge was given community service. A veteran denied the chance to speak because the judge had already heard enough. It wasn't just bad behavior. It was a systemic pattern of bias. Legal watchdog organizations demanded a full investigation. The ACLU issued a statement calling for Judge Jeffries' immediate suspension pending disciplinary review. Petition sites quickly gathered over 250,000 signatures in just 5 days. Under mounting pressure, Judge Jeffries finally broke his silence. He held a press conference outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Standing stiffly in front of a podium, he delivered a statement filled with familiar language. "What happened in my courtroom was a misunderstanding. My remarks were taken out of context. I have always served with integrity, and I apologize if anyone was offended." But no one was buying it. Because the audio was clear. His tone was clear. His words weren't taken out of context. They were recorded, repeated, and reviewed by millions. The public didn't just want an apology. They wanted accountability. And now, Judge Jeffries was under official investigation by the state's Judicial Oversight Committee. A panel of legal experts and former judges had been appointed to examine his conduct, not just from Eric's case, but over the span of his career. His courtroom was temporarily closed. His schedule was cleared. He was placed on administrative leave while the inquiry moved forward. Meanwhile, Eric Madison didn't seek fame. He didn't do interviews or post viral videos. He let the process speak for itself. When asked by reporters for comment, he simply said, "I stood up because I had the power to. But this isn't just about me. It's about the people who never had the chance to speak. I hope this leads to real change, not just in this courtroom, but across the system." One man's voice had started a storm. And that storm was long overdue. This story, while centered around a dramatic moment in a Mississippi courtroom, is not just about one racist judge. And it's not just about one brave federal prosecutor standing his ground. It's about something much deeper, much wider, and much more urgent. This is a story about a broken system. A system where personal bias can sit in a position of ultimate authority. A system where a black robe and a bench can mask the deep cracks beneath the surface. Where the decisions being made each day aren't just about traffic tickets or court fines, they're about people's lives. What Judge Ronald Jeffries did that day wasn't just an outburst. It was a clear, unmistakable example of the kind of discrimination that too often hides in plain sight. His words weren't a slip. They were a pattern, a mindset, an abuse of power that had likely gone unchecked for years. And the only reason this moment got exposed? Because the man standing before him wasn't just anyone. He was Eric Madison, a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Department of Justice. A man who knew the law. A man who knew his rights. A man who had the education, experience, and confidence to challenge injustice when it stared him in the face. But here's the chilling truth. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. And in fact, it does, every day, in courtrooms across America. That's why Eric didn't take to social media with anger. He didn't call for chaos. He didn't even name the judge in interviews until it became public record. Instead, he used his position to pursue what mattered most: justice. "I didn't speak up because I was angry," Eric said later in an exclusive interview. "I spoke up because I could. Because too many people can't. And because if someone in my position can be treated this way, imagine what happens to the people who can't fight back." That quote echoed across newsrooms, podcasts, and public forums. It hit hard, because it revealed the truth about privilege, even within the fight for equality. Eric knew he had the tools to fight back. But many don't. Many who face judges like Jeffries don't have legal training. They don't have resources. They don't have support. And so, they suffer in silence, fined unfairly, spoken to like criminals, and sentenced by someone who may already have decided their worth the moment they walked into the room. This case became a lightning rod, not just because it was outrageous, but because it was familiar. It forced the justice system to look in the mirror. As for Judge Jeffries, public pressure mounted. Legal authorities got involved. Civil rights organizations launched a full-scale review of his judicial record. In the weeks following the viral moment, dozens of former defendants and public defenders came forward with stories of similar treatment, spanning years. And eventually, the judge was suspended pending the outcome of a formal investigation. His future on the bench remains uncertain, but his reputation? That's already been decided in the court of public opinion. Because now, the country knows what he said, and what it meant. But more importantly, the country knows what Eric did. He stood up. Not with rage. Not with revenge. But with calm courage and conviction. He showed what it looks like to face injustice and respond not with vengeance, but with a demand for accountability. And that's the real story here. It's not just about calling out one bad actor. It's about calling out a system that allows people like him to rise and remain in power for so long. It's about recognizing that racism doesn't always look like violence. It often hides behind politeness, behind titles, behind robes. But no matter how powerful someone may seem, power does not protect you from accountability. And racism has no place in the justice system. Eric's quiet courage sent a loud message. And it reminds us all, justice isn't just a word, it's a fight. One that requires not just voices like Eric's, but people willing to listen, speak up, and demand better. From their leaders, from their courts, and from the system itself. Because when the system fails, it's not just a headline. It's a life. If this story made you think, or fired you up like it did us, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more real stories that matter, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your voice matters. Let's keep standing up, speaking out, and shining a light where others stay silent. Thanks for watching.